Hello, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives, and it's our great Harley Schlanger's going to be with me today to try to sort out what the heck is Trump up to now. Uh, Man, he's my head is spinning, and I imagine many people's are. But Harley's kept his eye on everything, and I can't wait to hear his view. So let's get started. And welcome once again, everyone. I am John O'Loughlin, and my guest today is Harley Schlanger of the LaRouche Organization. Hi, Harley.
Hi, John. I guess it's good morning to you, huh?
Good afternoon to you. And
Yep.
yes, thank you. We've got another 55 minutes of morning steer here on Mystery Island, where it's freezing cold and going to snow this weekend, which I'm kind of looking forward to. So I don't mind the cold so much, but I want some snow with it just to make it real.
We've got the northern lights blazing out here.
Blazing, huh?
Last night
Wow.
they were, yeah, it was really quite colorful.
Yeah. Was it all green, or was there some other colors in it, maybe?
There's some blue and some almost gold,
Wow.
yellow, yeah.
Wow. Wow. That's cool. I
And
have
we had our
never.
snow from January 1st until earlier this week. Finally, the last snowman melted.
Okay. All right. Till all the kitties knocked him down.
Yeah.
Um, Frosty the Snowman has a short but happy life. Um, last time we talked 2 weeks ago, you were helping us understand how Jeffrey Epstein uh, basically starts off with Les Wexner, and I've had the kind of dark thought that I wanted you to help me with, and that is President Trump also kind of under Wexner's thumb in some way?
Well, I wouldn't say he's under the thumb, but I would say there are some parallels to the network that ran Epstein and the ones that have at least are partly connected to Trump. I'm not saying that Trump was engaged in some of the funny business that Epstein was in terms of sexual activity, but one character who sort of overlaps both of those networks was Roy Cohn.
Yeah.
And if you know Roy Cohn, he was one of the dirtiest, nastiest fixers in the United States. And Cohn was tied to the Gambino family and organized crime, as well as to the Jewish side of organized crime, which was the Bronfman family, Meshulam Riklis, and that gang. And that was the group that provided the money for Wexner. Meshulam Riklis was one of the first guys to do junk bonds in the 60s. And he's the one who sold and sold to Wexner what became the Limited. And he did it through laundered money. This was the Max Fisher gang from Detroit, the Purple Gang, Dutch Schultz gang. This was the old Jewish mafia that was protected by something called the Anti-Defamation League. The Anti-Defamation League was set up in 1913 to defend Jewish criminals who were being accused of organized crime by the New York City police. And so it got its start by saying that the charges that they were engaged in illegal activity were anti-Semitism. And how often has that card been played?
Yeah.
So this was one network that was. Now, I don't think this is Trump's major network, but it's part of the New York real estate sector. So there were elements there that were part of the fixers that out of which Trump became a prominent figure. But Roy Cohn is the most important one. Now, I'm not saying that Trump was involved in illegal activity with Roy Cohn. What he learned from Roy Cohn is how to always be on the offensive. And Roy Cohn was always offensive.
In both senses of the word, huh?
Yes. Yes.
Wow. So Trump, I'm trying to fish out whether you think that Trump is a sovereign actor or whether he's still got strings pulling on him from past ties such as Wexner.
Well, I don't know if there's strings pulling on him. I think it's a question of identity, the identity of being a deal maker. The idea that he has the power to get people to do what he wants them to do. And we see that now with the threats to Europe. If they don't let him take Greenland, he's going to hit them with these tariffs. This is a lot like the insurance policies sold by Lower East Side Irish and Italian and Jewish mafia figures who would go to a store owner and say, boy, it would be a shame if that picture window in your store got broken, wouldn't it? But if you give us some money, we'll ensure that it doesn't happen. And then if you don't give them the money, it then gets broken. Oops, John, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Someone's calling me and I didn't disconnect the phone.
It's no problem. I had that problem myself yesterday, and for some reason, my computer started accepting phone calls and was ringing in the middle of a show, and I couldn't get to my phone. It was, man, these computers are crazy.
Yeah, let me just. Is she on, Carla?
Yeah. There's some good.
All right. Let me put it on airplane mode, and hopefully that means we won't be disturbed.
What an idea.
Let's see. I'm sorry.
No problem.
Today it's the last minute doing everything. Okay, it's on airplane mode, so it shouldn't have done that. Okay, I'm back. I'm ready to go. No, on the question of Trump, there is a part of him that it is what he said on this whole question of international law. He basically said, I don't need no stinking international law.
Right.
I'm my own law, and I'm guided by my own morality. Now, there's an element of that, at least in his mind, is true. But if you look at the swings in policy recently, 1 minute he's with the British, with King Charles. The next minute he's against them. 1 minute he's saying he trusts Putin and not the CIA. The next minute he's quoting CIA talking points. I think what we're seeing is a period of incredible tumultuous change. And this is the end of an era. The old system can no longer hold. And there are people who don't want to let it go because that's their power base. And those are the people who are the so-called deep state, the ones who have their own personal, have their own power, their own power base, the financial system, the corporate cartels. And they're somewhat powerless right now against forces they don't control. And the head of British intelligence now, a woman who's the head of MI6, gave a talk the other day, and she said, we have to be prepared to go against the United States because the United States is going against us. But the problem is the United States is also going against China, and China is a peer power. And this will be a tremendous problem for the United States. And that's how the British think. What I brought up in my update today is that what we're seeing is the end of geopolitics. And by geopolitics, it's where strategy is based on short-term advantage, manipulation, deals, threats, but not principle. There may be a principle there, but often the principle is, I want this, I want that. It's like a little kid. And so that's what we're seeing happen. It's breaking down. And so, some people were asking, well, isn't it good that that's happening? Yes, it is good because the system is not good. The system is based on impoverishing the vast majority of mankind for the benefit of the few. And the benefit of the few who get all the rewards think they're very generous and benign, and they're doing what's in the interest of the many because they think the many can't come up with a policy that's better. And what we're seeing now is the many are starting to say, what about us? Can we have sovereignty also? And you can't have an order run by the few and still give power to the many. And I don't know whether Trump thinks about it in those terms or not. I think he genuinely wants peace, but he seems to think that you can get peace by threatening. And, just say to the Palestinians, if you don't disarm, or to Hamas, if you don't disarm, you're going to have hell to pay. Well, that's not necessarily the best incentive for them to have peace. And what does it mean for them to have peace when Israel is still hammering at them every other day? So I think this question of principle is what's important. That's why Helga Zepp-LaRouche drafted this fundamental principle paper with 10 principles that underlie the Peace of Westphalia, including sovereignty, including the benefit of the other, including mutual benefit, and so on. That's how you get to stability and security. And so the Russians now are in a kind of ironic position because on the one hand, they don't mind Trump leaning on Europe because the Europeans are acting insane. The Europeans keep saying we're afraid of a Russian invasion. But at the same time, the Russians want to have an arms deal because the world is highly unstable. If you have two nuclear powers going at each other without a higher agreement, you have the danger of a nuclear war by accident. So it's really a nerve-wracking period. It's a hard time to be president, I think.
I don't think narcissist is an unfair adjective for President Trump. I just don't see how he's really got everybody's best interest in mind when he does these things. It's like to glorify Trump, he will send a ridiculous letter to Norway saying, "Oh, you dummies, you should have given me the Peace Prize. Now you're in trouble."
There was a funny meme that was sent to me the other day of Trump in a Greek native costume in front of the Parthenon saying, "I love Greece, I love Gyros, and I love John Stamos. But just because you've been here for 6,000 years doesn't mean you own this country."
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's the deal. That's the art of the deal. I had a piece of property that I really loved over where National Harbor is right now. And it happened to be a piece of property that was a corner piece on what was going to become the big National Harbor development that's there now. And it was just about 2 acres. And I really liked it, and I wanted to develop it, and I wanted to do all these great things with it. But one day, all the trees around me disappeared, and these big yellow machines were making a lot of noise, and they were taking down some of my favorite trees, and I was like, "This is awful." And then Mr. Peterson, Milt Peterson himself, who's dead now, but he walked up to my door and knocked on the door, and so I invited him in, and he came in and talked to me, and he basically said, "We'd like to get your property. We want to give you a fair price, and but if you don't want to sell it, I mean, I can tell you it's going to be construction all around you for the next 5 years. It's going to be difficult, for you to live here. It's going to, these problems are going to come about." And we'll give you a fair price now. So they kind of just give me a number, which was a little bit more than the reasonable value. And I upped them up a little bit and sold. because it makes so much sense. Because what I was trying to repeat to you is what Milt Peterson told me. He said, there's always more property. There's property everywhere. You move out of here, you go someplace else with the money, and it's nice. And so that's the mentality of real estate people, especially the big developers like Peterson companies. It's like, this piece of property could be anywhere. Yeah, 6,000 years is a long time, but you guys could have a nice Parthenon over there in Africa
But John,
somewhere.
I was talking one time to a Russian emigre, someone from a fairly prominent Russian family who lost everything. His family lost everything with the Russian Revolution.
Yeah.
He had a different view. He said, property, they ain't making a lot of new property, are they? Meaning there's only so much land.
Yeah.
And his idea was to buy as much of it as he could and keep it under his family's control. And ironically, he was someone who worked for the CIA.
Well, they know a few things, don't they?
Yeah. But, on this question that you're raising, it's interesting that you had this shift in Trump just in the last days, where on the one side, he was talking about ending the Iranian government, that it's time for it to go. It's got to be gone.
Yeah.
And after making these threats, apparently the Iranian regime said, we're not going to, we'll cut back from the attack on the population. And then Trump said, okay, so we're not going to bomb. Now then Bibi Netanyahu says, what? You told us you would take care of this. So you have these conflicting pushes and pulls. And again, this is why if you don't have a principle, and then look at what's happening with this Gaza committee. If a country pays $1 billion, it gets a seat on the committee. Now, this is the British imperial model. It's the way the British declared the mandate over Palestine during the League of Nations. How did they have a right to it? It wasn't their land. It had never been their land. And yet they were given responsibility for it. Now, Trump is trying to do that based on a buying in. You buy in and you get a piece of it. And if you don't, you're going to get sanctioned. So how does that bring about peace? How does that deal with the problem that's there, which is you've got a large Palestinian population with absolutely no rights that are recognized by the occupier? And in the modern world, there's international law which says that if you occupy territory, you have to protect rights of the people. And the Israelis have refused to do that. They don't recognize those rights. So how do you change that? What can you do? And so we had this seminar a week ago, Monday, with a number of prominent individuals from diplomatic, political, intelligence. Chaz Freeman was there. The former deputy vice president of the United Nations. Naledi Pandor, the former South African foreign minister. Dmitry Trenin, a leading Russian scholar. Zhang Weiwei, a leading Chinese scholar. And what they were discussing is how do you get international law recognized when you have the most powerful partner in an institution that's against it, referring to the General Assembly and the UN Security Council. If the United States wants to veto something in the UN, they can do it. If the UN is the one venue you can go to, but it's jammed up, what can you do? And there are some who are saying we have to form a new institution. That's what Chaz Freeman, the former one of the top diplomats of the United States, was saying. Well, I'm told that Trump is seeing this new Gaza committee as not just about Gaza, but as a potential discussion dialogue center that could replace the United Nations. Now, that's kind of nice from his standpoint because most of his supporters don't like the UN anyway. But, how do you guarantee that there can be an honest discussion? And the United Nations took quite a bit of time to accept the principles, the international law. That was Franklin Roosevelt's great project at the end of the war. And many of those are sacrosanct principles that are now being ignored. So, how do you get back to international law? And then there's the other caveat, which is, does international law mean what the US or great powers can dictate, the so-called unipolar order?
Yeah.
Because according to Anthony Blinken, the unipolar order was the rules-based order where everyone had to accept the rules. Except the problem was they kept changing the rules. So this is where you see we're back at a point where we're heading toward what Mrs. Zepp-LaRouche is saying is the law of the jungle, the Hobbesian world. That's the world that was set up after the takeover of Britain by the Dutch Venetian networks in the end of the 17th century, with the Bank of England, with John Locke, life, liberty, and property. You had on the one side Locke, who said, "Well, we'll make you an offer you can't refuse, a business deal." Whereas Hobbes said, "No, it's the power of the sovereign, the Leviathan, will rule by force." And those are the two options that the world is being given, as opposed to the idea that Plato and Socrates put forward, or that Nicholas of Cusa put forward, or that Benjamin Franklin put forward, which is that you have law based on what's natural law that comes from God, not from man. And that's the fight we're having now. And if you accept the idea that man is a beast, then the Hobbesian, Lockean alternatives are the only ones you have, because people can't figure out what's best for them, much less what's best for everyone else. So you have to have someone with power to enforce it, or some kind of agreement that's less than perfect. And it leaves out the idea that we can solve the problems we face by using human creativity.
I was reading some Thomas Jefferson the other day, and one thing that struck me was his belief. He expressed that ordinary human beings left to their own devices are capable of solving problems and doing good on their own without having to have, and this is the argument against a federal government, that you can trust humanity. And the problem we have right now is that humanity is divided up into interest groups which mutually mistrust each other. And, that all is tied in my mind to the overall arching desire of the people at the top to unify the world into a one world order, which I think has been going on a long time. Certainly the Catholic Church wanted to do it. Certainly the British Empire wants to do it. And now Trump is going in a totally different direction. He's saying, no, I'm not here to take over the world. I just want to focus on the United States. I want to make America great again. And in order to do that, we have to control what's going on in our hemisphere. And that is an argument for extending our empire, our what Jefferson, of course, called the Empire of Liberty, throughout the rest of the hemisphere. And that would include Greenland as well as Venezuela and probably most of the rest of the hemisphere.
How about Palestine? How about Nigeria? How about Yemen?
I don't think he wants
the hemisphere.
I don't think so. I think he's just talking about, the Americas. And what do you do about those things? Well, it sounds to me like he wants to wash his hands of it and walk away and say, you guys figure it out. Europe, you guys are so smart, you figure it out. And that to me is a recognition of something, if I can go on for a minute, that has been bugging me for some time. And that is, after World War II, okay, they create this United Nations, But there's a Security Council in what was 5 countries, and each one of them has a veto. I guess it's still that way.
Yeah.
But what that does is it freezes in place the power of those 5 countries, and those countries then are able to basically exploit the rest of the world. Whether with regime change, border wars, corruption, all of the things that we see all around the world happening, in order to maintain their own power. And so the idea that we have international law is a challenging idea for me. I think we've got a gang of oligarchs that, maybe nations as oligarchs, or maybe the power behind the flags in the nations as oligarchs. And we do not have a playing field in which international law could actually be enforced.
Well, and that is the problem. But then you get back to what's behind that. The idea is that the nations must be sovereign. They must have a right to act in the interests of their people. Now, what happens, and this is the problem that Blair and others point to, what happens if if a nation doesn't know how to act in the interests of the people, and it's an authoritarian government? Now, of course, I would say, to paraphrase an old saying, authoritarianism is in the eye of the beholder, that no government thinks it's authoritarian, but they think their opponents are. Now, what happens when you have a country, because of its poverty, it doesn't have a capability to exploit the resources of its land,
Yeah.
or because of the lack of education or the lack of machine tools, they can't develop an economy that enables them to pay for the future. And that's where the American model was a breakthrough. Because when the United States was constituted, it had wealth in terms of land, what we were talking about before. There was a lot of property available, and raw materials. But a lot of those raw materials were not known as raw materials then. There's the old joke that if you were a Texas farmer in the middle of the 19th century, and you were digging a well and you hit oil, what good was that? It made you angry because you were looking for water. So when you have to develop the technology to transform raw materials into resources. Now, what happens if that technology is in the hands of a few countries and they don't want to make it available? So they can say, well, you have your sovereign rights, but you're poor, so you have to live with that poverty. I think the answer to that is that George Washington believed that if you let governments and let people do what they wanted to do, they would act for the interests of their population. And that was the whole idea of representative government, not democracy. If you read the Federalist Papers, and I know you have, Hamilton argues against and Madison even, against the idea of democracy. The democracy is extended to choose the legislators, but then the legislators act for the general welfare, the common good. And they're supposed to figure out what that is based on what their constituents want. Now, for the modern governments, the modern political philosophy, the idea is that the people don't really know what's right, what they need. And of course, if you talk to 10 people about what do we need for the economy, you'll get 10 different ideas. But you don't have a dialogue, a discussion. This is where the education system is a problem, because people don't know what produces wealth. And they don't recognize that if you have someone who's sick and can't get health care because they're poor, that they can do less for the country than if they had health care and were well. And so, this is where private interests conflict with national interests. And then one nation's interest conflicts with another nation's interests. So, I wanted, I was just thinking before when you were talking, I wanted to come back to this question of this hemisphere. If you read what John Quincy Adams was doing when he drafted the Monroe Doctrine, because the Monroe Doctrine was really the John Quincy Adams doctrine. He was a Secretary of State. And his idea was that the principle was not allowing European imperial forces to exploit the people living in this hemisphere. It wasn't to say that the America should be the empire. And that's what you get when you talk about the Monroe Doctrine, that this is our empire. We can tell people what to do. No, the Monroe Doctrine was the U.S. military will prevent the exploitation of resources and people in the hemisphere on behalf of European powers, and instead allow the people who live in these countries to make the decisions. And that's explicit in what Adams wrote, John Quincy Adams, which became the Monroe Doctrine. And so what they're calling the Monroe Doctrine is much more of a Teddy Roosevelt corollary, which basically says the United States it's the sphere of influence of the United States. And that influence means we get first crack at the raw materials that we want. And the United States has tried to do that in Mexico and Venezuela, the banana republics. Why are they called banana republics? Because American manufacturers built up local gangs, essentially, to control the land and use it to export food and other goods to the United States. And when the people in those countries in Central America rose up against the banana republics, we sent in the Marines. So the idea is that the Monroe Doctrine is not to defend an American empire, but to keep the hemisphere free of influence of any empire. And this is what's being discussed now in Brazil and Colombia. This is the debate going on throughout South America. And in our country, we don't hear it.
No, it's all about Greenland or something out that the news can make into an outrageous thing that can be bandied back and forth and keep us fighting amongst ourselves. Trump violates some international law and violates all the rules. But on the other hand, Greenland represents what I recall studying in law, that at least it used to be, that if you owned a piece of property, but you don't use it, you don't develop it, you don't farm it, you don't have anybody come over and chop and for money, you're not doing anything with this land, then you should not have title to it. And other people can come along and say, you know what, you're not using this land and it should be used. It's productive and it can be productive. So you don't deserve to have it. And I think in a way, if Greenland now is not being productive, at least and it seems to be nothing but a great big island sitting there with 30, 40,000 people, I could see an argument that, you forfeited the right to develop it by just owning it for however long, Denmark, and you didn't do nothing.
Well, John, couldn't you say that the United States, with a nearly $40 trillion debt, is not developing its property?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And what it's developing is the military force to conquer other countries. So the question then is, who do you give this power to? The idea of the United Nations was that it was first and foremost a venue for discussion, for deliberation, with the idea that some of these problems are going to take a long time to work out. I mean, it was clear to the people who came up with the idea of the Security Council, the General Assembly, and all these different institutions under the UN, that there were complex problems that were not capable of easy solutions. But what they did was, because of private interests, make it even less possible. For example, in the Middle East, in Southwest Asia, if you have if you use international power, international law, to give one group of people the control of a territory when they're not even the majority. And when the Jewish population first proclaimed a Jewish state in 1948, they were a distinct minority of the people living there. And they took it upon themselves, and this was not just the rabid Greater Israel faction of Jabotinsky, but also the more Western modern labor socialists of Ben Gurion, who said, well, we're going to take the land because we'll develop it. Well, what do you do with the people who already live there, who in many cases haven't developed it because they don't have the resources? They didn't have the capability. The Jewish population had money from internationally to build up. But because of the divisions in the Arab world, there was no one who provided funds for the Palestinians to build up the Arab sector.
Let me ask you right off the top of my head, why couldn't the Israelis be good people and do the good thing, like a Kennedy type of thing where, oh, here's all these people undeveloped. Let's give them loans. Let's show them how to build a power plant. Let's irrigate some canals for them and help them grow their agriculture. Let's be that good American that I think a lot of us think of when we think of John F. Kennedy's promise to the world.
Well, there were good Israelis. There were people who did recognize that you could not control the Arab population by force, but the dominant faction was under the influence of a man named Vladimir Jabotinsky, who set up the revisionist party in this is before the Jewish state was confirmed by the United Nations. But Jabotinsky and his movement led the fight to get the British out. And they developed an army or certain military capabilities. There were the terrorists also, the Stern Gang, what became the Likud, the ones who blew up the King David Hotel to kill the British. So you had armed struggle going on within the Jewish population. And then on top of that, you had some of the Arab neighbors. Some of them were willing to have a democracy there. Others were not. The Saudis did not want to have a democracy, an Arab democracy there that would take away their power. So you had all of these mixes. Now, the problem was that the worst decision was made by dividing land and saying that we will allow certain people to have more benefits than others. And so you created a dissymmetry there, which was exploited by people who were opposed to having these Eastern European Jews shipped into Palestine to take over the country. The line of the Zionists was, this is a land without a people,
right?
A people without a land. But that was a false statement. There were people there. In fact, it was almost for every Jew that was first in Palestine in 1946, 47, there were 10 Palestinian non-Jews, Christian and Muslim. And there were hundreds of thousands, I think there were 60,000 Jews and 600,000 or 700,000 Palestinian Arabs. And yet the majority of land was divided up for the Jewish population. That was what the British did. Now, was it intentional because they were opposed to the Arabs? Was it, what was the basis for it? There's a whole library of books arguing that. But the essential factor is that Lord Rothschild and his group in London convinced Balfour and David Lloyd George and others that the Jews would be better allies for the British than the Arabs. And at that point, the British were looking for allies. It was after World War II, the question of what would happen with the Ottoman Empire. Would the Russians move down? Would the British lose India, which they eventually did? There are all these questions. And so for the sake of the British interests, and by British, I mean the interests of the establishment, they wanted to empower desperate Jews with weapons and capability to serve the interests of the British Empire. And that's what caused the problem. And if you were a young Palestinian student in the 40s and 50s, you saw no way to create a state. And eventually, that led to the creation of terrorist organizations. But the terrorists were people who were trying to defend their people from the expansion of the Zionist state. So, you have this, which came first, Arab anti-Semitism or Jewish anti-Arab sentiment? And the fact is that neither of them were there a century earlier. And that's why I cite this book by Avi Shlaim about his family coming from Iraq. He was from an Iraqi Jewish family. And he said that didn't used to be a contradiction, that they were Arab Jews. They had influence in Iraq. 1/3 of the population of Baghdad in 1947 was Jewish. There were 50 synagogues in Baghdad. Now, who today, who has this image of the Arabs as anti-Semitic, would believe that? But once you had the 1947-48 changes, which created the state of Israel, then for the Arab world, the easiest argument for the problems that the Arab countries were having was that it's the Jews. And so you had an increase in anti-Semitism, or really it was anti-Zionism. But that hardened over time, and that's where the problem is today. There was a moment where there could have been steps taken to establish a community of principle among two different people, or more than that. I mean, there are all kinds of different Muslim sects that didn't agree. You had different Jewish sects that didn't agree, still don't agree.
You have Christians there too.
Yeah, you do. And what was done was to say, well, the British at a certain point said, we're going to wash our hands of it. We're not going to get involved, except the oil is ours. And that's where you see the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which became British Petroleum. That's where the Saudis played a role. The Saudis were basically an American-British alliance. This is where the problem lay, that there was no sense that these were people who had legitimate rights to sovereignty. And so they were essentially used as a constant source of friction between nations there.
The idea of people not being worth consideration is prominent in everything that I study in 20th, 21st century stuff. The idea that that all, we all say it. I mean, alle Menschen werden Brüder. We're all brothers. We're all brothers and sisters. And, Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. Well, okay. When are we going to start practicing that in our daily event, in our daily lives? And the answer is we're not. It's certainly not in Israel or Palestine. We're certainly not doing it in Ukraine, and we're certainly not doing it in the United States, where violence is increasing and the media is drumming it up as much as they possibly can. That I want to, before we lose the rest of our time, Harley, I want to get back to the question of whether the United States is going to attack Iran. And I know that's something you've been studying assiduously. I don't know if you saw Scott Ritter's latest videos over yesterday, and which I was looking at this morning, in which he comes out and says, "Well, Trump screwed it up. Trump didn't have the right, the aircraft carrier, and then somebody screwed up or maybe the Iranians just got real good at intelligence work and were able to screw up the Starlink for the Mossad guys that were, stirring up the revolution. And according to Scott, they've all been rolled up." That question of, has Trump intentionally thrown a monkey wrench in what was going to be a horrific new war for the United States in order to, well, either for his purposes or I hope for the good of mankind?
Well, see, this is where you see two or more Trumps. On the one hand, he is definitely listening to Bibi Netanyahu. And Netanyahu is saying that, look, Iran is not just our problem, it's your problem. A nuclear Iran is everybody's problem, and we should stop it before it happens. Now, the problem is the JCPOA, the agreement that was reached on Iran and nuclear weapons, would have prevented Iran from going ahead with a nuclear weapon. And Ritter knows that because Ritter was an inspector. He was involved in that. And he knows that Iran shut down the nuclear weapons program and that the Ayatollah issued a fatwa against nuclear weapons. So Iran was not developing nuclear weapons. It was abiding by the terms of that agreement. Who canceled the agreement? It was Donald Trump. And so you had the Iranians looking at the broad landscape of that whole region. And what do they see? Gaddafi was told, give up your weapons of mass destruction or else we're going to come get you. So Gaddafi did. He gave them up. And look what happened to him. The same thing, Saddam Hussein. It's clear that Saddam had shut down a nuclear program and a chemical weapons program. A lot of the chemical weapons in Iran and Iraq came from the United States so that Iran and Iraq would kill each other in the 1980s war they had.
Yeah.
As soon as they gave up those weapons, they got attacked. So our policy says to the Ayatollah and Iranian nationalists, if you don't have some kind of weapons capability, you're next. And the U.S. has essentially said that. But still, they're not, according to the estimates of the International Atomic Energy Agency, they're not building weapons. They have the resources to do it, but they're not building it. So our policy is forcing that. Now, what else are we doing with our policy? When you say, well, Iran is oppressing its people, that's why they're poor, they're hungry, because they're using their money for building nuclear weapons and so on. It's not true. The reason they're hungry is because of the sanctions regime that the United States has carried out against them. I'd really like to hear one official say that the Ayatollah's policies are not starving the Iranian people. It's the sanctions policies. And the evidence we have of that is what Madeleine Albright and Bill Clinton did to the Iraqi population that killed 500,000 children because of the sanctions. So, in the interest of honesty, the problem of Iran for the United States is that it doesn't do what we want them to do, but it wasn't causing trouble. The only place they caused some trouble was where they defended the Palestinians. And you could argue that it was a morally justified act to try to help the Palestinians to come out from under Zionist genocide. That's something that could have been debated and discussed. Instead, it's that they're the terrorists, they're the villains. The Israelis are the victims. And so that's where you see how history is bent. If I have a minute, I'd just like to read you something that Lyndon LaRouche said at an event honoring Martin Luther King in 2004, because it gets at this question of what's wrong with the thinking of the American people. Um, can I do that?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. He starts out by saying, we don't teach that all human beings have rights, that man is different than the animal. Instead, he's arguing that the idea of a Hobbesian man, that we're just creatures of seeking comfort and avoiding pain. That's the view we have of man. So he said, we don't teach the view of man that Martin Luther King had. Look at our standard curriculum. Our education policies now are a crime. You don't know anything, you learn to pass a test. We're no longer concerned as a nation with developing people. We used to believe in developing people. We've become like Rome, ancient Rome, a society of bread and circuses. Get your crumbs and be entertained. Then he goes on to say, today, for example, do people work? Is their mentality one of working? Do they believe in work? Do they believe the society gives them the opportunity to work? No, it doesn't. It gives them the opportunity to get some money. And then he says the mentality of the country is that if you're getting lucky and winning the lottery and winning at the track, that you're getting ahead. Even though industry is collapsing, your farm is gone, the city government can no longer afford to take care of your essential needs. We've gone into becoming a gambling society. We rely on what? Mass entertainment. Isn't that something you really should be ashamed of? We no longer regard human beings as human. We no longer are interested in what is human. Now, this is how we've slipped in to a Hobbesian society. You mentioned Kennedy and the idea of ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Well, instead, we have this mentality. We ought to get something from the country. We ought to get something. We're entitled to something. And what we're entitled to in our system is working, doing the good, working in the community, giving children the idea of citizenship. And instead, we've taken that away and substituted personal comfort and avoidance of pain. So, if you look at this question of the idea that if you're rich, you must be smart. Now, if you listen to some of these people like Larry Ellison of Oracle or Peter Thiel of Palantir, they're rich, but they're not very smart. They're manipulative. They've learned how to use what the British developed of the Aristotelian system to take power away from people. Because what gives us our power ultimately? That we have a capacity to be creative and work together with other creative people to build a better society. That's what LaRouche's idea is. That's what should be discussed at the UN. That's what should be discussed in city government and in factories and in universities, instead of how do I make the next million? And I think that's fairly profound condemnation of our society. And in that sense, Donald Trump is the right president for that society.
Well, I do agree with you, but I do not think that the average person should take the blame for this. This has been an indoctrination that has been going on in my lifetime. And this is why I think we really have got to go back to President Kennedy and understand why he was assassinated and what the result of that is, and what a big change our country has taken since that day in terms of exactly what you just spoke about, because America has always seen itself as being the champion of the little guy, not to take over the little guy, but to help him rise up. And that is, the soul of what our country stands for, but it's been taken away. It's been taken away by the powers that fear overpopulation, that don't mind seeing a bunch of people die of a disease, or don't mind seeing people killed in war over in Ukraine and around the world. These people are the Hobbesians that you speak about. That just everybody is just a brute, no different from the animals, and so they need to be herded and prodded and pushed around until they do what we need done, and then they're expendable. They're just useless eaters. That philosophy has taken over the top branch of our society. And until our society recognizes that and says, no, we're going to throw you guys out of office, we're going to get rid of all this kind of inhuman thinking, that nothing's going to change.
But that's why I say that the American people do have some of the blame for that, because this has been going on. We've been seeing our society degrade. We've been seeing it go down. And when President Trump ran in 2016, when he ran again in 2024, he said he was going to take power away from these guys. He was going to expose them. He would show the secret government for what it was. He hasn't done it for whatever reason. And supposedly he told someone, well, if you knew what I know, if you'd seen these documents, you'd be afraid also. But that's not good enough. He was elected on a platform of cleaning this up. And it's our responsibility to back him to do that. But it's his responsibility. He's the one who's the president. He's the one who can cut off the arms deals with Netanyahu and cut off the arms deals with Zelensky. He's the one who can change these things. And instead, he still is making the argument, for example, and I'll be very quick on this, on immigration. The problem is the people who come over here, not the fact that their countries have been destroyed, which make it important for them to survive, to come here. So there's a push-pull on all these things, but there's a higher morality that's being ignored. That's the point LaRouche is making. And that's what the Peace of Westphalia was based on, the idea that each human being has a right to live a life where they can be productive. And we're denying that to whole sections of the population. But some of them are comfortable because they have video games and sports and things of that sort to while away the time.
Which is provided to us practically free once you get online, and you can just sit there and watch Facebook reel after Facebook reel. And I've caught myself doing it. It's like they know how to reel you in, so to speak. And all of us are looking at our computers and our phones. That benefits them. As much time as we spend getting entertained or letting our mind, just be entertained by the media. It sends me a little note, says, you were on this device for 9 hours and 36 minutes today. I say, wow, I spent 9 hours on my computer, and I do it day after day after day. Well, I think I'm doing research, don't you?
My kids use the term, the German word is Langweil, like bored. I'm bored. So that's why I have to watch the video games. Then if you watch the video games, to me, it's boring, but it's an escape from reality. And that's what the problem is. Reality is tough.
Very tough.
But if you don't face it, you're going to be victimized by it.
All right. Harley Schlanger, thank you so much for another very interesting and I think fun hour of tossing things around. And boy, I hope we don't go to war in Iran, and I hope that Trump really does have the best interest of the American people at heart. And I guess I have to wish him, the best, because I'm so glad that the other candidate didn't win. That's it's still with me that would have been we'd have been at war with Russia. We'd have had all lockdown. We'd all been bending over for jabs every 3 months. It would have been horrible, in my opinion. So
I agree. So the American people did something right in the 2024 election, but now we have to see it through, make sure it's fulfilled.
Thanks very much, Harley Schlanger. We will see you again in a couple weeks, I hope. And everybody take care. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.